Part of what makes fantasy fiction so appealing are the tropes that have become signatures of the genre. And yes, it's true, many of these tropes can get overused, they can kind of wear out their welcome, though for some people, those common tropes are the things that are comforting to them. They're what they love and expect to find in fantasy. But whether we're talking about common tropes or not, tropes are the DNA that make up fantasy. There's many tropes that have been around since the beginning, from epic quest to prophecies and chosen ones. And there's even newer tropes that are just being defined. I'm going to be exploring all the tropes that are staples of fantasy fiction. They can be transformed, subverted, or embraced, but each serves as a foundational element that helps define fantasy. Understanding these tropes can be useful for both writers and readers. This is my ultimate guide to fantasy tropes. Before getting into it, the channel has been blessed with a sponsor. You all thought I was addicted to reading. Well, somebody call me a therapist because I have a new addiction and it's Magic Spoon. I can't stop eating this stuff. Seriously, I've been eating so much of this cereal. They sent me this special silicone bowl and a literal magic spoon. It does magic and everything. Finding a high-quality breakfast cereal with no artificial flavors is very difficult. And the thing is, like, cereal has so much childhood nostalgia tied to it, but it's all very sugary. And as an adult now, I realized I have to actually take care of my body. Magic Spoon has that nostalgic flavor, but with way less sugar and a lot of protein. It's a low-carb, keto-friendly breakfast that's also gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and wheat-free. And, I mean, on top of that, it's got 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 3 to 4 net carbs and 140 calories per serving. And it's even got games on the back of the boxes. I love that. Thanks to Magic Spoon, I can be a kid again and eat cereal without worrying about the ingredients I'm consuming. And they even have Magic Spoon treats, which is the perfect snack when you're on the go. Click the link below and you can build your very own box with all the amazing flavors that you love, and use my code CAPTUREDINWORDS for $5 off your order. They have so many amazing flavors like cocoa, frosted, cinnamon roll, peanut butter, maple waffle, and so many others. I think my favorite is probably blueberry muffin, and I mean, you gotta try the treats as well. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, they have a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it, you can get a refund and get your money back, no questions asked. They even ship to Canada and the UK, so use my link below or scan the QR code up above and use the code CAPTUREDINWORDS to get $5 off. Or go to magicspoon.com/capturedinwords to save $5. Huge thank you to Magic Spoon for sponsoring another video. I'm gonna eat this now, so back to the video. Okay, I'm gonna be separating these tropes into 3 different categories: plot tropes, character tropes, and setting/world building tropes. Please keep in mind, there is an endless amount of tropes out there, and the task of putting it all together into an ultimate guide, I'm obviously not going to be able to cover them all. I'm trying to get to as many as I can, as many of the common ones that we know in fantasy and that we often see. But I am just a mere man, I can't include them all, so let me know in the comments any of your favorite or least favorite tropes that I didn't mention. What tropes? We're gonna start off easy with the classic good versus evil trope. This is a staple of fantasy. Here we have a protagonist fighting against a powerful villain, or dark lord if you will, or some larger evil force. This often embodies 2 clashing moral ideologies in which the oppressive ruler is challenged by either a sole hero or an opposing force of good. Oftentimes this trope is used to show good morals and values, which is why it works really well in middle grade and young adult fiction. It's also used in a lot of classic fantasy. The heroes of these adventures are challenged and tempted by a great evil, eventually overcoming it in the end. Really, it's a trope as old as time itself, and a lot of the classic forefathers of fantasy use this trope to near perfection. Some classic examples of this, of course, is Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, and J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. But good versus evil has grown over the years to include its general subcategories or evolutions. And as with most things in fantasy, once a story is told, it immediately begins to get picked apart and reinvented to create fantastic new stories. The Waiting Evil is one of these evolutions or extensions of good versus evil. The story begins with the world in a silent oppression in which a great evil is lurking in the background, Possibly this evil was long ago said to be defeated or locked away, but as the plot begins, it's clear that this evil is returning and is a major threat. It schemes and manipulates the story towards its end goal. Now, this can also be called dormant ancient evil, and we see it in a lot of fantasy series, even in A Song of Ice and Fire, with the Others. When the first of the first men, 8,000 years ago, set foot on Westeros, the Others were already there, waiting for new victims. And they may even be older than that, given that the Children of the Forest, another very ancient race, carried obsidian weapons that are the kryptonite for the Others. Also, The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan is one of my favorite examples of the waiting evil. In The Wheel of Time, the Dark One is a cosmic force of evil who, if freed from his prison, will eventually remake creation in his own image, basically acting as like a Satan figure within the story. Now, there's 7 Quindalar discs bearing the symbol of the Aes Sedai, which act as a focus point for the actual seals which hold the Dark One in his prison. And these ancient seals are turning up broken. And I'm sure you can think of many other fantasy series that use that waiting evil trope, but it all comes back down to good versus evil. There's many different evolutions and branches of that trope. It's that classic ancient trope that's always been a part of humanity. And sometimes we try to subvert that or twist it by including shades of gray. Grimdark is a genre of fantasy that focuses on the moral ambiguity of the protagonist. You're often following characters that fall into that shade of gray. They may do both good and evil, and oftentimes Grimdark can be very violent and dystopian and bleak. I made an entire video on Grimdark recommendations, some of the best Grimdark books out there, so make sure to watch that video if you're looking for recommendations. Moving on from all the good versus evil tropes to focus on another very common trope in the genre, the epic quest. We got a protagonist traveling through dangerous lands to achieve a goal that's greater than themselves. The motivation could be to find the MacGuffin item, save the princess, or defeat the evil overlord oppressing the heroes. Stories like this often include a lovable cast of characters that are exploring the world that the author created. And that actually goes into another trope that would actually fall under the character tropes, and that is the fellowship. I love the fellowship trope, whether it's, you know, the fellowship, the crew, the band, just a group of travelers getting together and going on an adventure, having the banter between them, the diversity of all these characters with their own backstories and motivations. That's one of my favorite tropes, actually, is the fellowship. Now, the quest often allows the reader to experience the world the author has created through the lens of this ragtag group of adventurers who are often experiencing it for the first time themselves. They're learning about different cultures and societies and coming into contact with dangerous monsters and creatures. Now, modern fantasy has actually moved away from the quest a lot. It's not as common anymore. I still love the quest trope, and one of my favorite modern fantasy books that uses this trope is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. And of course, this also has a really great like fellowship or crew trope. Basically, Kings of the Wild is a get the band back together book. It follows an old group of mercenaries that get together to do one last mission and save one of their members' daughter. And also, the mercenaries in this world are kind of like rock stars. It's awesome. If you're a D&D fan or a fan of JRPGs like Final Fantasy, then I highly recommend checking out Kings of the Wild. Now, of course, other examples of the quest include The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, even Percy Jackson and the Olympians by Rick Riordan, or the Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. The coming-of-age adventure following a young protagonist as they slowly mature throughout the series and often learn lessons and learn more about themselves along the way. They start out as dewy-eyed, youthful, inexperienced rookies, and they eventually become fully fledged like assassins or wizards or something like that. The focus of this type of plot is usually centered around personal growth and the transition between free-spirited youth and responsible adulthood. Some stories like this have a pretty stark contrast where it starts off very kind of lighthearted and then it quickly goes into like really dark, dangerous stuff. Even Harry Potter, for example, started off pretty, you know, innocent and fun. Then once you get past the third book, it gets much darker, which I guess just represents growing up and witnessing the horrors that is existence. Characters are often exploring their identity, they're losing their innocence, and growing into themselves as they face the challenges that this world throws at them. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is a coming-of-age story where we have the adult version of the character telling his life story from childhood. We see him grow up and make dumb, stupid mistakes and not know how to talk to women and slowly grow into the legendary but tragic figure that he is in the current day. Arya from The Song of Ice and Fire goes through a dramatic shift where she's forced to mature much quicker. Another example like this is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and it is a very, very emotional journey following the protagonist, Fitz Chivalry Farseer. Fitz has honestly gone through enough for all of us. He deserves a little bit of peace. I love Fitz, but yeah, very emotional journey. Many fantasy stories often involve a prophecy or sense of destiny, and the plot follows the protagonist trying to either make that prophecy come true or try to stop it and prevent their destiny. And often these can overlap with some of the tropes I'm going to talk about in the characters trope segment. This is where, you know, chosen ones and reluctant heroes often have some type of prophecy or destiny they have to fulfill. Oftentimes these plot lines focus on the choice or the lack thereof of the protagonist, maybe even exploring ideas of free will or responsibility. We got prophecies in the Wheel of Time, we got prophecies in the Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, we got prophecies in The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks. There's a lot of prophecies and destiny in fantasy. The heroic sacrifice. I am putting this in plot tropes, not character tropes, because oftentimes the sacrifice is plot related. These are characters that willingly accept death or just great pain in order to save others or to advance the plot or for some type of goal. These are the martyrs that are trying to achieve some greater goal. They're fighting for some cause and they realize the only way to accomplish what they need to do is to sacrifice themselves, helping drive the motivation of the protagonist and all the others who are close to that character. These are usually the really good characters that have a sympathetic or honorable nature and will be remembered fondly, and that highlights the tragedy. It's difficult to mention this one without spoiling anything, but there are characters that we all know have a heroic sacrifice. Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, Dumbledore, Snape, Sirius Black, all those characters from Harry Potter. I was about to mention one from a popular Sanderson book, but that's probably too much of a spoiler. Anyway, as a writer, the heroic sacrifice can actually work really, really well to pull at the heartstrings of your readers and also to motivate the protagonists. Okay, those are all the ones I'm going to cover for plot tropes. Now moving on to character tropes. Starting off with the chosen one. This is one of the most common and polarizing character tropes in fantasy. It's one I actually really enjoy. There was a time I thought that the chosen one was overdone, but honestly, there are so many books that I still love to this day that use the chosen one trope. So I realized I actually like this trope a lot if it's done well. Now these are characters that are exactly as they sound. They're rising above the others to face some great evil. The entire plot revolves around them fulfilling their purpose. Their motivation can be to defeat some great evil threat or prevent a calamity or save a large group of people. Regardless the motivation, they're usually always saving the world in some way or another. Oftentimes they have great personal turmoil they have to try to overcome in order to come to terms with and fulfill their destiny, often satisfying some form of prophecy as they grow into their role within the narrative. And this oftentimes is grouped in with the reluctant hero trope. The chosen one doesn't want to be the hero. They don't want this destiny, and eventually they just have to come to terms with it. And like I said, it is very common to see people hating on this trope because it's been overused so many times. But really, in the hands of a talented author, I feel like the chosen one is just such a satisfying journey. I know I've mentioned the Wheel of Time a lot, but Rand al'Thor is one of my favorite chosen ones. We see him grow up from this country bumpkin into a just very complex character with so much going on. And I really enjoyed that reluctant side to him and how Jordan really explored the madness of being the dragon reborn. In a similar way, Harry Potter is the quintessential chosen one. I mean, he is the boy who lived. He defeated Voldemort once and is destined to defeat him again. The Belgariad is a very classic, like, farm boy to chosen one story. It has a lot of common fantasy tropes in it, but it's also just very cozy, and it has some really memorable characters. Next, we have the Dark Lord. These powerful villains usually embody and represent the antithesis of everything our heroes stand for. They're oppressive rulers or commanders boasting incredible influence over the world. They're the ultimate antagonistic force with an immense presence and dominating ambition. Dark Lords often seek the destruction or domination of something, whether that be a group of people, a concept, or the entire world itself. Some people just want to watch the world burn. And while the Dark Lord is a very common fantasy trope, it's one that I think can be done really well and make for just very memorable antagonists. I really enjoy a good Dark Lord, especially when they do have some really tragic backstory, where they once were a good, heroic person, but after tragedy, they transformed into the monster they are. And usually when we have a Dark Lord, it's the hero and their allies that end up defeating the Dark Lord, proving that morals and goodness and all that is superior to the villain's cold and malevolent nature. Good versus evil. Yes, we already talked about that. I'm glad you're listening. Some examples, of course, include the Dark Lord Sauron, who seeks to dominate Middle-earth. And then, of course, we got Tom Riddle. I mean, Voldemort. I mean, the one who should not be named. The noseless one. One of Brandon Sanderson's inspirations for writing the Mistborn series was to write a series where the Dark Lord has already won. He already defeated the hero a long time ago, and now the world has been remade in his image. The Mentor, or the old wise wizard trope. This is one of my favorite tropes in fantasy. Basically, the Mentor is that character that the protagonist wants to be. It's that super skilled breakdancing wizard, or it's the strong mercenary that can like slice an arrow with their blade. Usually the mentor or the old wise wizard is in fact old. They have a vast wealth of knowledge and wisdom and skill to share with the protagonist. And it's the mentor's job to teach them about the world and help develop their skills and get them ready for the journey that's to come. Honestly, I will accept this trope any day. It doesn't matter what fantasy book it is. I always enjoy a good mentor or old wise wizard, whether it's Gandalf or Dumbledore or Moraine or Iroh or Jiraiya. The mentor is one of those common tropes that is just really cozy, and it serves a purpose as well. Even as a kid, I wanted to shake Zuko to listen to Iroh because obviously he knows what he's talking about. Okay, now I already mentioned reluctant hero when talking about the chosen one, but let me just elaborate a little bit. These saviors of humanity to be have no interest in glory or in taking brilliant risks in order to save the world. They don't choose to live out the life of a hero, but adventure chooses them. And usually this adventure is unexpected. It gives them this responsibility that forces them into the plot. These characters usually struggle with their morality and grapple with the self-discovery that comes with being a hero. And usually the reluctant hero is interesting because they're not driven by like justice like many other heroes are. Usually it's some type of outside pressure that is pushing them into their position. One of my favorite examples of the reluctant hero is the man who shot first, Han Solo. And of course, he also falls into the lovable rogue or the scoundrel character trope. The scoundrel is usually a charming but morally ambiguous character that operates on the fringes of society. They're often skilled in deception and they're self-serving, but they usually possess a hidden, softer side that makes them endearing to the audience. Scoundrels often play by their own rules, and that adds a layer of unpredictability to their character. Another great example of a scoundrel is Locke Lamora from The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. In fact, he suits the gentleman scoundrel role very well. He's a master thief and con artist leading a band of criminals called the Gentleman Bastards. He's charismatic and cunning, living by his wits in a city that's ripe for the taking, and he's one of my favorite characters in fantasy. The Grey Mouser from Fafnir and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber is a great classic example of that agile thieving scoundrel. And of course, another one of my favorite characters who falls into this role is Matrim Cawthorn from The Wheel of Time. And usually the scoundrel provides some comic relief and charisma and some unexpected moments of heroism. The Secret Heir. This one is just like how it's described. It's when a lineage or bloodline is kept hidden until some big reveal later on in the story, where we find out the character is secretly royalty or part fae or something like that. And usually these characters come from humble beginnings. They've lived a lifestyle that's far removed from the royalty that's in their blood. Terran from the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander is an example of this, and that is a very underrated fantasy series that you should check out. The Anti-Hero. This is a character that lacks the traditional views of justice and heroics. They're usually very morally ambiguous, they have a tainted view on good versus evil, and they fall into that gray zone. These are often heavily flawed characters, and this gives them the opportunity to be very complex. They might have a witty tongue or a cynical outlook on life. Oftentimes, the anti-hero is motivated by complex ideals. They have a really interesting backstory, and they offer some nuanced opinions. Oftentimes, the anti-hero can also be the more honest and human character. The type of character that says it like it is. These are the characters whose actions are going to be seen as questionable or self-interested. And oftentimes, they have a very complex set of ideals and motivations. Sandan Glokta from the First Law series is one of my favorite anti-heroes. He's a former hero turned torturer. Glokta is a deeply cynical individual who struggles with his past and his current role within a corrupt system. Not to mention, he just struggles getting up the stairs due to his disability. But despite his ruthless methods, Glokta's sharp intelligence and dark humor makes him such a compelling character. Logan Ninefingers, also from the First Law, is another character I really enjoy. He's this barbarian with a very dark and violent past who's trying to change and become a better person. But despite his attempts, his violent nature often overtakes him. Thomas Covenant from the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant by Stephen R. Donaldson. Covenant is an outcast and a leper who's transported to a fantastical world where he becomes a pivotal figure. But his refusal to believe in the reality of this fantasy world and his morally ambiguous actions create a really controversial and deeply flawed character. Jaime Lannister from A Song of Ice and Fire is a character that goes through a big evolution throughout the series, and obviously he's a character that has a lot of moral dilemmas. He makes some questionable choices, his motivations are complex, and overall he is the quintessential anti-hero. Found family. This is one of those tropes that's been used a million times, but it still hasn't overstayed its welcome. It's one of my favorite tropes to see. This trope is all about exploring connection and finding family in characters that aren't bound by blood. Just like the Fellowship or the Crew, the found family is usually made up of a ragtag group of characters from various backgrounds, each with their own beliefs, passions, and ambitions. However, the focus of this trope isn't about how different they are, but rather how close and accepting they are of each other. And sometimes this takes a while. Sometimes they even start off as enemies, or they don't quite like each other, but because they're experiencing this journey together, it ends up bonding them and they become like family. And a lot of us can relate to this trope with the close friends that we've gained over the years. Vin from the Mistborn series is a character that started off with a lot of trust issues and paranoia, but eventually, after working with this ragtag crew and being accepted into their ranks, they become like family, and she learns to trust and to love. And Vin is a really complex character. I put a lot of effort into making this character study video of Vin, so if you're interested, make sure to check that out. Then we have the classic underdog. Now, it can be very satisfying to see a character who's looked down upon or shunned by everyone else slowly become more powerful or respected. And book 1 in the Cradle series by Will White, Unsold, is the perfect example of an underdog story. Lyndon isn't allowed to learn the sacred arts of his clan due to his deficiency being unsold, and this means he's pretty much shunned by his entire clan. Now, we slowly see Lyndon's rise to power as he gradually becomes stronger. And again, this can be very satisfying. This is something we see in a lot of shonen anime and manga, stuff like Naruto and Bleach. To be honest, it's a trope I always enjoy, but when the underdog always wins, it could kind of be predictable. Sometimes predictability can be comforting though, and with the underdog story, it gives the reader a sense of agency and empowerment because we align ourselves with those fighting against the odds. Not to mention, studies have shown that the literal act of witnessing an underdog story gives us hope. So if you're a writer trying to promote a sense of hope and optimism within your book, then the underdog is a great trope to go with. Okay, now with character tropes, I'm also gonna throw in some romance tropes that we often see in fantasy, starting off with love triangles. Now, the problem with love triangles, why so many people hate love triangles, is because it simply feels lazy. It feels like an easy way to make tension. Usually the love triangles aren't very thought out, and they're usually very predictable on how they're going to end. And on top of often being poorly executed and almost always predictable, it's just been overdone to the point of cliche. Now, do I think there can be good love triangles? Yeah, I feel like an author can use a love triangle to create tension and drama, and do it in a satisfying way that doesn't feel as predictable and as forced. I just can't really think of any examples, to be honest, so let me know your examples in the comments. And then of course there's also enemies to lovers, and this one's very self-explanatory. And the key with this trope is to keep on building the tension. Now, something that doesn't really work to me is insta-love. Again, this is one of the laziest ways of writing romance because there's no tension there. This is when two characters automatically fall in love with each other and you know they're destined to be together right from the beginning. And basically this skips over all the tension and their character arcs growing together and seeing their chemistry grow together. To me, it's just not really a satisfying way to write romance. However, I do think there is a place if you're strictly writing a romance book, but I mean, if you're writing epic fantasy that just happens to have a romance subplot, I feel like you need to give the characters the time to actually grow together and for the readers to see that chemistry come off the page. Okay, moving on to setting / world building tropes. Magical creatures. Who doesn't love a dragon or a talking animal or some other mythical creature? These oftentimes can even be a companion to the protagonist or a dangerous threat. They often help enhance that otherworldly aspect to this magical world and help build that sense of wonder. And of course, you can branch off to other tropes from magical creatures. You have, dragons, animal companions, familiars, elementals, shapeshifters. There's so many different branches to this trope. I'm a big fan of the dragons from the Earthsea books by Ursula K. Le Guin. Also, one of my favorite animal companions is from the Abhorsion or the Last Kingdom series by Garth Nix. Seriously, one of the best animal companions ever, and I highly recommend the audiobooks. Okay, now this next one, I'm just gonna call the Ancients. This includes ancient civilizations, ancient artifacts, and ancient mysteries. We're talking underground temples that are imprisoning ancient terrible beings of evil, or lost artifacts of incredible power that are sealed beyond magical wards. Hey, give me a good Indiana Jones or Uncharted or Tomb Raider type story in my fantasy, and I'm there. I mean, that's one of my all-time favorite tropes. These tropes add a layer of mystery and typically make for a really great adventure story. Now, this can also lead into other more niche tropes like Lovecraftian entities and ancient astronauts, as well as more common tropes like the MacGuffin item. Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky is a novella with a twist on the Ancients trope. The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams is a great example of this trope. Same with The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. Next we have fantasy races, and this is like a cornerstone in fantasy. There's a lot of the classical races like elves and dwarves and orcs and goblins, all of that, and a lot of these races have been reimagined and reinvented, but usually there are some similarities. I mean, elves are usually these wise beings that have lived for a long time. The drow elves from the Forgotten Realms kind of put a twist on that noble high elf trope, and are instead these evil dark elves who serve the spider goddess Lolth. Orcs are generally very barbaric and ruthless, but we also have some authors who develop their own unique fantasy races, and I really love to see when authors put in that effort to create their own unique fantasy races that make them stand out from other works. The crustacean-like Parshendi with their rhythmic hums and their different forms from the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson is one really great example of a unique fantasy race. The weird blue-skin giants from Mistborn, known as the Koloss, are another really interesting fantasy race. They're grown with all the skin they'll ever need, so they have this gross, droopy skin. That is until they grow into these giants and their skin ends up stretching and splitting. Really, really disgusting visual. Another very common fantasy setting trope is the medieval influence. Welcome to the world of knights in armor, brilliant castles, political drama, and courtroom banquets. Medieval influence was the poster setting of fantasy for many, many years, and it still is for the most part. Countless stories have drawn their influence from the medieval aesthetic in order to tell their epics. These feudal societies often boasted stories of chivalrous knights in martial combat, warring or battling for their honor and their kingdoms. And these stories, shrouded in chainmail, are often heavily inspired by Europe, roughly between the timeline of the 5th and 15th century. Religion, politics, nobility, and honor are among the core tenets of this trope, using the setting to explore various adjacent themes throughout the story. A very iconic example of this is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, which used the War of the Roses as inspiration. A fire crackles in the corner, scenting the tavern with the smell of burning logs. Laughter and drinks are shared within fantasy's staple fixture of the tavern. These little rest points are a reoccurring thing in fantasy. It provides a place for the cast to share hearty meals and sing together, which often provide a sense of camaraderie and unity between the protagonist and their allies. And it really helps break up those moments of battle or tension as they're traveling. The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan probably has my favorite examples of the tavern. There's so many different inns and taverns they go to that offer a really cozy feeling. Also, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Of course, we have the Waystone Inn, as well as the Aeolian. If it's a medieval or Tolkien-esque high fantasy, you're very likely to see a tavern or an inn of some sorts. Moving on from that, we need to talk about the magic school setting. This is a very common trope as well, and it's one that many have grown tired of. But honestly, I just can't get enough of the magic school. Whether it's a school of young magic users in the making, or a university or college accepting adults as well, I mean, it makes sense. Schools would be the foundation of a magical society. Oftentimes, these schools are hidden or secret in some way, or there's some special prerequisite for being accepted. Sometimes the school might be divided into factions or houses, and the whole academy is led by a colorful cast of powerful professors or masters who each have their own specialties. There's just something about training scenes, or just learning and getting an education in magic, or exploring some esoteric library that I find so entertaining. It also helps that the magic school also connects with the mentor trope, which I love as well. Now, considering most of us spend a considerable amount of our early years in school, this type of setting can also be very relatable as well. I'm also just a big fan of strong friendships or friend groups, as well as rivalries, and we see a lot of those elements in the magical school setting. I've always been pretty big into Harry Potter, so that may have contributed to my love for this trope. It's also another reason why I love the Kingkiller Chronicle, and of course, the Earthsea Cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. One of my recent favorite books is The Will of the Many by James Islington, and this also has a really strong school setting. More examples include the Codex Alera books by Jim Butcher, Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence, or The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. The Dark Spooky Forest. This is a trope that's been around for a long time. I mean, it goes all the way back to us telling stories and fables around a campfire. You gotta admit, there's something eerie about the forest. I mean, yes, it can be a beautiful place as well, but if you're walking through the forest alone or at night, there's something almost foreboding about it, and countless stories have been told about the mysterious, eerie, or supernatural occurrences that happen in dark forests. You never know what creature is lurking, watching you, and the scariest moment is when the forest goes completely silent. Now, even though the creepy forest has been overdone time and time again, I don't get tired of it. Even when I was little, the creepy forest was my favorite part of watching Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. One of my favorite, more unique examples is Brandon Sanderson's novella Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell. This is one of my favorite novellas for this very trope. It just makes for such an eerie setting. Now, the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden is another great example, and it's the perfect story to read on a cold winter night. Uprooted by Naomi Novik also has that cottagecore dark forest vibe. Now, the dark forest trope is related to another trope, and this is moments of horror in fantasy. Fantasy has a tendency to delve into some really dark themes and truly terrifying moments. I mean, this is a genre where the author can invent any kind of monster or creature that haunts the corners of their imagination. Whenever there's mention of nameless things in the dark, or the heroes encounter something that strikes fear into their bones, it only adds more tension and excitement to the scene, and I think small moments like this every once in a while work so well in showing the reader what the heroes are actually up against, or what dangers exist in this world. In the Old Kingdom series by Garth Nix, despite being a young adult series, there is some truly terrifying moments. I remember the first time reading it, I was filled with so much dread whenever there was some encounter with a monster, even just the way they're described. The tangy metal smell filling the air, it just gave me goosebumps. In the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, there's a creature called the Alzabo, and it takes on characteristics of animals that it eats. And when it eats people, this includes personalities and voices. And we, the reader, don't know if those people it eats somehow still have consciousness within this creature's mind, or if it's using their knowledge and voices to manipulate their loved ones. Truly a terrifying monster. The Wheel of Time also has many moments of horror, whether it's the Murdrill, or Machin Shin, or even the Shan-Chan's casual cruelty. Named weapons or legendary weapons. These are relics that have some fascinating origin to them, or some vast and unknown lore. There's just something obviously epic about our heroes acquiring some mythological item. Maybe it's a sword that's talked about in tavern tales or ancient writings. Weapons that are said to once be wielded by great men or women, or forged by sacred deities or skilled craftsmen. Yes, there's Sting from The Hobbit, but one of my favorites is always going to be Gandalf's sword, Glamdring. Personally, I like it better than Sting and Anduril. It just has such a mythological quality to it. Of course, there's also Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, the swords from Tad Williams' series of the same name, as well as Icing Death and Twinkle, which are the dual scimitars of Drizzt Do'Urden from the Legend of Drizzt series. And one of the best named weapons I can think of is Dragnipur from Malazan Book of the Fallen. Even the story behind this sword's abilities are just out of this world. I also happen to have a love for sentient weapons, like Stormbringer from the Elric saga or Nightblood from Warbreaker. Next, we have divine intervention. Now, this one can be used as a way to establish the world's deities or gods, and a great epic mythological story of gods intervening in humans' everyday life is something that's always really fascinating in fantasy. But many times, divine intervention is used as a way to help the main character slip out of an uncomfortable bind. And in these more common cases, the divine intervention doesn't always need to be a god or deity, but rather a character or MacGuffin that allows the protagonist to find a way out of a bad situation. Now, this is where it leans more into becoming a deus ex machina. Basically, this is the younger, more disliked brother of divine intervention, where in divine intervention, there's usually a clarity behind who's providing the great salvation to the protagonist. Deus ex machina has a much more negative connotation. This trope is usually referring to a sort of bailout in the story, where an unexplained element or unintroduced character is suddenly inserted into the narrative to help the characters avoid what would have otherwise been terrible consequences or tragic outcomes. Now, if handled with care, sometimes the Deus ex machina can actually work. I mean, there's also the here comes the cavalry trope. The cavalry being any type of support that's given to the hero just in time. And like we see with the Ride of Rohan scene, these can be done well. It just needs to make sense within the story. Okay, we need to talk about plot armor. This is basically when your characters are protected by danger or death because they need to survive for the story to continue. When plot armor is obvious, it is one of the worst tropes in my opinion. It just takes out all the conflict and the tension because you know the characters are going to magically avoid danger because they need to. However, I do see a lot of people speak about plot armor in a negative way, but also you sort of need plot armor for a story to work. Again, the problem is just when the plot armor is abused and it's way too obvious for the reader. But really, no matter what story it is, there's some type of plot armor in there. And there we have it. That is my ultimate guide to fantasy tropes. Like I said, there's a lot that had to be left out because there are countless tropes out there. But let me know all of your favorite and your least favorite tropes in the comments. I also have a video where I tier rank tropes, so maybe you want to watch that one next. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe. And a special shout out to my most recent highest tier patron, Anna. Thank you so much for the support, along with my other highest tier patrons, Josh and Mike Baker. Guys, the support on Patreon truly goes a long way to helping me make these videos, so thank you so much.